Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you. Thank you, Vicente, for those opening remarks. And it's great to be with you here on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Quite the week to be in New York and to discuss the issues ahead. So if you look at the topics throughout the day, you'll see a common theme. We're going to talk about the future of food security in Africa. We're going to talk about the future of Europe and as it relates to integration of Ukraine and Moldova. We're going to talk about charting a new phase in the fight for Uyghur rights in China. And we're going to talk about the top risks and opportunities in the year ahead. The common theme, of course, is that we are looking to the future and the frontier of these urgent issues. And that's not a coincidence. So at the Atlantic Council, our mission is shaping the global future together. You're going to hear from many shapers of that global future today, including those in the audience joining us right now. And also, next year at this time, the United Nations is going to hold a summit of the future. And the focus of that is to integrate more long-term thinking about the future impact of policies into international governance. And I'll quote from how they describe it. One goal is to forge a new global consensus on readying ourselves for a future that is rife with risks, but also opportunities. Peter, that's very much in your wheelhouse. You are the Deputy Director of Foresight at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Council's Global Energy Center. I'm glad you've joined us today to help kind of frame the conversations we'll be having throughout the course of the day. So, Peter, if we could start, I'm curious from your perspective. You're at the Atlantic Council, our resident Foresight expert. Why do you think the United Nations and Secretary Guterres is having this future focus? Is prioritizing this. The way they frame it is it's not just about the near-term future, it's about future generations today and future generations that don't exist yet, and how our policies impact those people. So what's your sense of why the UN is prioritizing that? And I'm curious if you're noticing any kind of more general uptick in interest in foresight and how it relates to policy.
Sure. So hi to everybody, and delighted, of course, to be at this AC New York event today, and to kick it off with Uri and talk about the future, which is, of course, something that we're all concerned about, but also hopeful for at the same time. So, first of all, I applaud the Secretary General and his efforts to surface this topic within the UN system, and to surf it really in spectacular fashion. First with our common agenda, the big report that his office released a couple of years ago, and then next year with this summit of the future idea. Because you're correct when you say this is in my wheelhouse. It's music to my ears, because it means that he personally, as well as his office, and therefore the priorities of the UN system in general, are looking towards a future-oriented framing and aperture, which is, I think, an appropriate way to think about the world that we inhabit. I don't know what specifically animated him to do that. My guess, and I think it's a presumption that is based in part on reading what's in our Common Agenda report, but also what I've noticed elsewhere, is that really when you have turbulence in the global system, you get a lot of interest in my work, in my field that I'm in, which is kind of a bad thing in a way, right? When you have a lot of turbulence, turbulence is not always bad, it can be good. But you do get a lot of interest in this line of work, and because that turbulence disrupts our expectations about what's happening in the world and where it's headed. There's always turbulence in the global system, but I think it's fair to say that we've been living through a good 10, 15, maybe longer years worth of turbulence across many different areas of concern and interest in the world that we can talk maybe a bit more about later. And in fact, we've coined a new word for this called the polycrisis, right? Which is sort of like everything is in trouble all at once, right? And I think that is the ground truth for why there's so much more interest, not just within the UN, but in general around the world, in governments, and also private, philanthropic, academic contexts, and others.
You run our Global Foresight shop, as I mentioned, which puts out, I brought props. We have a Global Foresight package that we put out for the last couple of years. And you know, it's not gotten everything right, certainly, but it's a forecast about the year ahead and beyond. And for example, in 2021, it predicted Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, China's economic challenges, and also, I believe you did this one, the rise of lab meat, which has just been approved by the FDA. I don't think we're serving it today, but it has been approved and has borne out. In 2022, it predicted Russian state fragility, which we saw with Prigozhin's mutiny, of course, and also it predicted the rapprochement between South Korea and Japan. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little more about what this global foresight package is and how it fits into the foresight work that we're trying to do across the Atlantic Council as a whole.
Sure. So Global Foresight is a brand exercise in part by us, by my shop, to surface foresight as a modality of thinking and a few other things. And as you just said, with your shop's cooperation, a significant partnership, we produce this every year now, comes out at the end of the year, and it contains predictions is a bit of an overstatement. I always joke if I could predict, I'd be very, very wealthy, and I'm not. But it does contain assessments of how we think the world is turning and where it could be going over different time frames and through different pathways of thinking, and importantly, through bringing in different voices from within the Atlantic Council. So both our senior staff as well as our junior staff, it's very, very important that we get youth contributions into this document. As well as external voices that we bring in through really a survey wherein we ask people from around the world who are considered to be experts in various fields how they think the world's going to unfold over the next decade. So we do this every year. The point is to highlight the kind of thinking that we do, to highlight the people inside the organization that have some really good ideas about not just the world that we live in right now, but where it could be going. As well as what voices from outside the organization might be thinking about that as well. And so far, over the past couple of iterations, we've gotten a lot of traction from within the Atlantic Council, which maybe that's also something we could talk about in a bit, but also externally, of course, there's a lot of interest from the media in this kind of analysis. And so we're hopeful that this year's version, which will come out in December, will follow suit.
And there are different elements to the package. One is a top risks and opportunities list for the year ahead. And Peter, putting you on notice, I want to ask you to give us a bit of a sneak peek about, you'll be putting the list together, so I'm curious what your top risk and opportunity is for 2024. And in our afternoon session today, we're going to bring up a bunch of experts in regional and thematic centers to ask them as well to kind of peer into the near future and give us a sense of what the top risks and opportunities are. So that's coming shortly. But I guess taking putting myself in the position of a policymaker, a million things going on, you know, the urgent often crowding out the important. Why should policymakers, whether they're at the United Nations or in national governments or in local governments, I suppose, why should they care about foresight? Why is it useful to be integrated, to have that integrated as a discipline into the policymaking process, into national and international governance?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perpetual source of frustration, I think, among foresight practitioners in the world like myself, which is, you know, the sort of the near term and the kinetic, right, the sharp, often gets a hearing, and the longer term and usually structural gets the marginalization. My own answer to that, well, that has a lot to do with human psychology. We tend to discount the future as our species. I think there's some probably evolutionary biology elements in play there, but we do. We discount the longer out into the future that we look, the more we discount that and the more we value what's right in front of us. So I think that translates into institutions and organizations as well. But the reason, the more sort of practical reason why policymakers ought to care, and people also, by the way, in business and in running non-governmental institutions ought to care, is that the fact is the future constantly surprises us, and often in unpleasant ways. So in other words, the future does not equal our expectations about the future, and that's really what matters at the end of the day, right? And that the future is disruptive. In fact, it's almost never linear, a linear projection of what we think is going to happen. And so therefore, what we're trying to do in my practice is to work usually through systematic ways with stakeholders that we engage at the Atlantic Council in challenging some of the assumptions that people make about linearity, their assumptions about how the future is going to unfold really through a simple projection of what they see in the world. And to challenge those assumptions and to disrupt, if you will, those expectations about the future. And therefore, that allows us to develop strategies that are more resilient in the face of disruption, right? Wherein we're trying to do two things at the same time. One is that if we cast a range of scenarios about how the future may unfold, that we have some sense of what we could do in the short and medium terms to prevent the worst case scenarios for us. But also we can build strategies that can help us to be more resilient in the face of those same kinds of scenarios should they unfold.
So in that sense, you see Foresight as not deterministic, that it's an exercise to give policymakers, they can shape, you can give scenarios for the future, but they have agency, in other words, to shape some of those outcomes if they know what could lead developments in one direction versus another. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a fair assessment. I mean, look, it's very difficult to actually control, right? I mean, policymakers are always looking for ways in which they can control the present and the future, right? It's a very difficult thing to do, and it's especially difficult to do if you're walking into it blind, right? It's less difficult to do if you have some sense of we need to pull these levers to avoid these kinds of scenarios in the future. Doesn't mean that you're guaranteed that that will be the outcome, but you have a more plausible chance of doing that. But I would place a lot of weight, though, on these two other things that I mentioned, which are, one is craft approaches, strategies for managing your institution, strategies for managing your government, for running a nation or a business, that will prove more resilient across alternative scenarios. Because again, it's almost impossible to predict, which is why I say I'm not in the prediction business.
Right.
Okay. And the second thing is it's critically important because you've got to change the way in which people think, and you can do that systematically over time within an institution if you value foresight as a mode of thinking.
I was having an interesting conversation with family members the other day where we were talking about in our personal lives how much we think about the past versus the present versus the future. It's an interesting exercise because everyone's got a different answer about how often they think about the past, and it kind of speaks to personality types, et cetera. I'm curious if you apply that governments are made up of humans, and I'm curious how you would think about that on a government perspective. Like, where would you say is the percentage breakdown of how governments think about past, present, and future? Are they thinking enough about the future? Yeah, I'm curious what you make of that. I know it's hard to make a blanket statement, so all governments are different, but I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think based on what I just said, the answer is no. They're not thinking systematically enough about the future. I think that the breakdown is, in my mind, is this. So my PhD is in history, which is ironic because I now write about the future for my living. I think the past, so if we look at how governments approach the past, the present, and the future, the past is emotive. The past is about collective memory. And it's also often about myth-making or myth preservation. And often it is about political contestation, right? The historian in me sort of rebels at a lot of that because a lot of that is not actual history, like what actually occurred. But the past animates governments from the standpoint that there is a collective memory of what the past is and what that means for you as a government and as a nation. So look at Russia, for example, how Putin and Russian leaders often look to their history and make certain interpretations about it for what they do in the present, right? And we all do that to some extent. So I'd say it's more of a question of memory, right? That's the past. The present, of course, is where politics lies. Right? That's the art of the possible in the now.
Yeah.
Okay? And that is 80% of what's going on. Okay? My advisors in graduate school often called that presentism, and that was not a happy phrase that they would use, but they would call it presentism, the dominance of the present over everything else. And the future, as I said before, I think is discounted. There's aspirations about what we would like to have and see, and also to avoid. But sort of this systemic thinking about how the future is going to unfold and therefore sort of planning what we ought to be doing and strategizing around that given the alternatives that are in front of us, that is not absent, because there is that, including within the U.S. government. But it is, I think it's fairly clear to say that that's, a relatively small weight and percentage.
Who do you think is doing this well? Are there certain governments that are kind of modeling how to think about the future, to be more resilient? The United Nations is clearly trying to do this at their next year. But are there certain pioneers here that we should all watch and learn from?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I don't want to be, excuse me, too negative. The U.S. government does have some outstanding foresight capabilities, particularly in the intelligence community and defense, and a few other places scattered around the U.S. government.
Yeah.
The trouble they always have, including some people, by the way, who have come and worked at the Atlantic Council in the past, outstanding analysts, no question. They do very, very good work. The question for them always is getting a hearing among, and their ideas being taken seriously. And part of that is simply the scale and the size of the U.S. government. It's so massive that it's hard to do that. But if you sort of skip around the world, the usual answer to your question would be Singapore is one that has taken foresight very, very seriously for a very long time. The Foresight shop there is put in the office of the Prime Minister, so it's right next to the Prime Minister. I don't know if that literally is, if you can walk across the office and walk into the Foresight director's office if you're the Prime Minister. But the point is that the Foresight was put into the Prime Minister's office to assist the Prime Minister to think about, in other words, the senior-most person in the entire government, think about these things that we're talking about here today. So they're usually the one that people point to as saying they're kind of at the forefront of this. And that they also, of course, have the advantage of being a very small government, right? And that's actually to their advantage in this particular case. There are a few other governments that are analogous, that are doing these kinds of things, maybe are in the middle between sort of the U.S., what I just described about the U.S. and Singapore, particularly in Europe. The EU tries to do some stuff in this space too. They've got a really, really good foresight shop, but again, the EU is this very large animal.
Well, I want to get more specific on how foresight can apply to specific things you see in the year ahead, and some of the topics we'll be discussing today. One more, I guess, general question. I'm curious, share what the world looks like through your eyes right now. When you look out in the world and look at trends and discrete news developments, we're always focused on the event that happened here, the event that happened there. I imagine you're kind of sorting things into trends and categories that you're tracking to understand not just where the world is headed in the coming year, but where it's headed in the coming years and decades. So what are the categories you're tracking? What are the trends you're tracking that you're sorting all of these discrete developments that happen in our news every day into?
Yeah, so there are 5 or 6 big buckets that we're always thinking about. You have to start, given that we're the Atlantic Council, you have to start with geopolitics and the trends that are going on in geopolitics. That's standard IR stuff, okay? That's major power competition. The trend line there is down, unfortunately. In other words, major powers increasingly aren't happy with one another, and that's a problem for all of us. China, of course, is a big topic here here in the States, but I was about to say here in Washington, but we're not in Washington. China, and the reason why China is important is because of how meteoric its rise has been over the last 4 decades since the economic reforms in the late 70s and early 80s, and how it's sort of a rising power, not just any old rising power, but a rising major power. So we look at that, and then also we look at sort of the firmament of sort of coming powers. I put India in that category, and sort of middleweight powers, many of whom are increasingly restless with the multilateral system, because that multilateral system was designed during a different era when the power dynamics were very different. So that's clearly one. A second would be technology is a category that we're doing work in almost all the time. Tech is a weird one, and the reason why it's weird is that it's both a trend and an uncertainty. Tech is a trend in that new technologies are being developed and scaled all the time, literally every single day, right? But it's an uncertainty. The problem with technology is that it's very, very difficult to plot who is going to invent the next truly disruptive technology, when and where that's going to be done. And even more important than that is the second and third order consequences of tech development. So an example there would be social media, right? So 20 years ago, roughly, when social media was first invented, and then sort of with Facebook scaled, if you will, and it became this massive global thing, there was an incredible amount of hope around social media as being this force for it was almost treated as an unalloyed good, that it would be this thing that would give us much more transparency, it would give us more democracy, it would give us more knowledge about the world. Some of those things are true, right? But a lot of those things have turned out not to be true, right? And that was the hard thing, I think, to call, in part because there was so much optimism around it, and I think that optimism actually clouded, I think, our collective judgment. So that's a good example, I think, of tech. It's that tech is difficult to forecast which technology where and by whom, and then what's going to happen as a consequence.
One quick question there.
Sure.
Do you think that applies to artificial intelligence
Sure,
too? Are we being blinded by the current assessment of what it'll be?
So I'm what I call a tech realist. I can't think of any technology that's ever been an unalloyed good except for the bicycle. That's the one that I can...
Heard it here first, folks. Bicycle.
The bicycle.
Yeah.
Aside from that, it's hard to think of a technology that's... I'm being facetious, okay, so don't...
It's pretty good.
But it is good. I like
that
line. I'm a tech realist because, I mean, technologies most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time have upsides and downsides. And you have to walk into an equation where you see it that way, right? That technologies, for example, do, as a matter of fact, create a lot of wealth. I mean, the standard of living that we have today in the 21st century, everything that we're enjoying right now is entirely due to science and technology, right? Not entirely, that's not also an overstatement, but you get the point. But there's often a lot of turbulence, economic turbulence that comes with that, and there are losers in that equation, right? People who are on the downside of those technological disruptions, and we don't pay enough attention to those dynamics, I think, societally. And that's just one example of this kind of thing. So AI, I look at it in those terms, right? I mean, so there's a lot of enormous potential for AI to do some very powerful and productive and good things for the world, but at the same time, we all know that there are some very profound concerns about AI, in part because the technology is developing so fast that we don't have a good sense of where it's going and how to control what it gives us. That we do need to take very seriously the notion that, you know, we need some governance around this technology. So that's tech. Do you want me to keep going on the list?
Give us a few more.
So the other big buckets would be environment and climate. So we're clearly overstepping environmental boundaries of all kinds. Climate change is just one of those things. I mean, there's other boundaries that scientists are telling us that we're overstepping. Here we're talking about carrying capacity of the planet, so biodiversity would be a good one, right? Demography is another big category of analysis. Demographic change is usually slower than the other types of changes. If you're talking, for example, about fertility rates, they tend to change very slowly. But some things are a little bit more dynamic. For example, migration can be a little bit more dynamic, migration patterns. Urbanization is also a big phenomenon, mass phenomenon, that's very, very, very disruptive to the world in mostly good ways. I've written a lot about it, actually. But I do regard it as something you could lump into the demography bucket. And then last two would be society and politics, you know, everything that we talk about when we talk about society and politics, and then the global economy. But the one point I want to say is when you say, Uri, to me, how do I see the world? I do see the world across all those things, but the point is intersectionality. How do these things work together? And that's really where not only the most interesting conversations are to be had, but I think the most consequential.
Got it. I'm wondering, you know, the next panel that we'll have after this one is on the future of food security in Africa. And you, I know, helped lead a conference last year in Bali on the sidelines of the G20 that was focused on food security. You wrote a memo afterwards about the fierce urgency of food security, as you put it, and the need to apply foresight to have transformative, innovative solutions to the complex challenge of global hunger. Yeah. So I'm wondering if we can get specific here. So, like, what is a foresight lens on global food security? It's a big, complex, global challenge. How would foresight help address that challenge?
Yeah, so food is, you know, an example of intersectionality that I just mentioned, and really it is a vast food systems, and they are plural, but they're, you know, truly global. They're ubiquitous, and they're intersectional. In other words, you bring in to your analysis probably all 6 of those categories that I mentioned. You know, clearly climate change, for example, or energy systems, water systems, would be one bucket you would have to bring in if you're talking about this in any real way. You would have to bring in the tech bucket into the conversation. You would even have to bring in the geopolitical dimension, sadly. Sort of the world is flat logic of the 90s and 2000s, Tom Friedman's famous book on this topic. That world seems to have disappeared, right? And we're in a world of harder edges and sharper linings, if you will. And that's playing out sadly in the food space, as we're seeing in the war, with the war in Ukraine and the Black Sea grain deal. And so geopolitics is now sort of the shadow of geopolitics is overhanging even trade in the most basic of goods, which is food. So the way in which I think about, so if we're going to talk about the long run here, which is going back to the Foresight thing, right? And when we start talking about food, I really have to think about it like in really two big categories of analysis, and that is what are the trends on the demand and the supply side of food, right? And so on the demand side, we know that population growth in the world is slowing, but it's still growing. And we're probably going to reach around 10 billion, maybe a bit more before population levels out in the world that everyone needs to eat. And what that means is that you need more calories. And you need also more nutrition. Food security experts will say those two things are not the same, by the way, so that's maybe something you can discuss with your food panel later. But calories and nutrition are not the same thing. But if you're looking at just calories, which is the aggregate amount of food that we need to feed that many people, that's going to continue to grow. So that demand signal, that's going to grow. So you need a set of food systems that can give you more food in aggregate. Hopefully healthier food at the same time. And those two things are also not the same. At the same time, you have a clear equity problem on your hand. This is a demand side thing, right? In other words, there are starving people in the world, there are hungry people in the world. That is unjust, unfair, and needs to be rectified. So it's a bit like maybe the energy equation, right, where you have sort of so-called energy poverty in lots of parts of the world. So that's the demand side. On the supply side, you've got, I think that's where the biggest problems lie. And the supply side, in other words, how can you get more calories, more nutritious food to more people more equitably? Okay, how do you do that given some structural challenges? Now, we all know that since Malthus at least, we've talked about a world in which there have been fears of demand outstripping supply. And I'm not being a Malthusian when I say this, but I'm saying that there is going to be a challenge wherein supply and demand need to come together. And supply, the way in which we've met in rising population and rising wealth in the past is a combination of really technology on the one hand, so improved agricultural implements of all kinds, chemicals and tractors and stuff, but also through expanding the amount of land that we've farmed and ranched, and also the amount of fish that we've pulled out of the oceans, primarily the oceans. Okay, two of those three things are disappearing or reversing, land and fish. So in other words, we don't really any longer have the luxury of farming more acres, except maybe on the margins, and we also aren't going to get many or more fish out of the oceans. So really that leaves you with sort of the technology curve and also different methods. And you have to be able to produce all of that in an increasingly climate constrained world, which is a major problem going forward. So in my mind, what that means is that we need to be much, much more creative about thinking about new modes of how we produce food, where we produce food, what technologies we develop and invest in and scale, how fast we do that, to make our system do three things. It's more productive, it's more equitable, and it is more protective of the planet that we live on. Not an easy equation.
Got it. And by the way, on the technology piece of food security, we're going to have the next panel is going to focus on agri-tech solutions. So part of it is this question of how can technology be brought to bear to address it.
I should say that, I mean, the tech thing needs to intersect with the ecology thing.
Yeah.
100%. So, ag tech needs to be also green tech, just to clarify. Yeah. That's where I fall on that one.
So now I want to get to the year ahead for the last few minutes that we have here and ask you some questions about what you're thinking about for the top risks and opportunities in the year ahead. Because this is going to be a topic for our afternoon panel. We're going to ask some of our regional and thematic experts for their top risks and opportunities. Then that's all going to feed into and inform a list that Peter is helping put together on the top risks and opportunities in the year ahead. Look out for it in December. And so I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of a sneak peek here on, you don't have to get to all, we often do a top 10, we're not going to do all that. But I'm curious, what are you thinking at this initial moment of what a top risk would be in the coming year that you're looking out for?
Yeah, so when I answer this question, we've talked about this before already, but risk you have to think about as both probability. It's a combination really of probability and consequence, right? So the one I'm going to talk about, I think, before I don't want to frighten anybody, but is low probability, low to medium probability, although it's rising, but hugely consequential if it happens, which is why I'm saying this is one of the top things I worry about, and that is armed conflict between nuclear powers in the coming year. I didn't say a nuclear exchange. I said armed conflict between nuclear powers. In other words, a shooting war that is not yet nuclear, but of course, if there is a shooting war between, a shooting war in quotation marks, in other words, some kind of armed exchange between nuclear armed powers, that has the potential to rise to a nuclear exchange, right? And I said it's low, but also I said that it's rising, the probability. And the reasons for that, I think, are that, geopolitics, as I said before, we've got this sort of, the major nuclear powers, generally speaking, don't like each other, and that trend line is going down. Okay, that's a problem. Second, we have an actual shooting war between Russia and Ukraine right now that is on the doorstep of NATO. Okay, and NATO and Russia aren't exactly friendly these days, and that tension between NATO and Russia is heading in the wrong direction. Third, of course, everyone talks about Taiwan, and the reason why there's so much nervousness about Taiwan right now, in particular, whether it's the coming 12 months or the coming 5 to 10 years, is this perception that China sees a window there, and that window will close at some point in the 2020s. Whether it's the next 12 months is a different question, but in the 2020s, wherein she sees that thinks that China needs to act while there's this sort of window where China is rising and strong and its military is capable, and it can do all of this before effectively demography takes over, essentially, China's trajectory. So that's the third one. A fourth, though, is that we don't talk about, I don't think, enough, is like there are various norms and fail-safes that we're systematically undoing in sort of the nuclear context. So, Russia's been saber-rattling the nuclear agenda for the duration of the Ukraine war, and it's, I think discounted quite a bit in terms of the actual use of a nuclear weapon. But nonetheless, the fact that they're willing to cross that norm to sort of even indirectly imply use of a nuclear weapon is, I think, a dangerous erosion of a norm. And then finally, tech is also eroding this equation, going back to the tech thing. I mean, we're building all kinds of technologies now that could easily upset this sort of strategic nuclear balance in the world. Hypersonics is a good example of this. And as a result of all those factors, I think we're entering into a more dangerous world. Whether that turns into a greater risk of an armed conflict remains to be seen. But if I were to go around the world and look at the different bilaterals between different major powers, I think the risk order probably be NATO, Russia first, which means US, Russia effectively if you're talking about nuclear powers, Britain and, as well. But, and then second would be US, China, third would probably be India and Pakistan, then Pakistan and India, and then North Korea and the United States. So those are the five, and at the top of that list I'd say probably Russia and NATO would be the most likely of those.
Do you feel that the probability of that occurring, while you said it's low, is higher than it's higher than it's ever been since the Cold War, or do you think it was higher in 2023, or right after Russia's full-scale invasion?
Well, I mean, aside from some really existential crises we had during the Cold War, I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the big example, and a few accidents that we nearly killed every one of us, right? And Berlin, showdown in Berlin in '61, that our president has written about eloquently, the president of the Atlantic Council. Aside from those kind of hotspot sort of moments, most of those, by the way, were in the early years of the Cold War when we were settling down into sort of this stasis that we had during the Cold War. Towards the end, it was a pretty stable system. Yes, we had this sort of shadow of a thermonuclear exchange hanging over us at all times, but the risk of an actual shooting war short of nuclear weapons between the Soviets and the United States was pretty low. So I'd say it's higher now actually than then, which is frightening. Doesn't mean it's high. Don't misquote me. It's not high. I'm just saying that it's there, and I think the trend line is in the wrong direction.
And if it only needs to happen once, right? Yeah.
Well, you know, the famous phrase is hopefully cooler heads will prevail. And you know, if you do get into a shooting war before you get into the missiles launching, but you don't want to get to that point.
Yeah. And lastly, what's the top opportunity you're thinking about in the year ahead?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the other things that I'm very concerned about, of course, and I know we all are, is you know, democracy, right? The future of democracy around the world. Democracy has been, depending on who you read, in decline for quite some time, a good 10, 15 years, maybe longer. And next year there are going to be some very, very consequential elections around the world. The U.S., India, European Union parliamentary elections, Mexico, South Africa, all have elections for consequential offices. And so I think, you know, it's both a risk and an opportunity. The risk is, of course, that you know, the illiberal forces will succeed. They will continue to take advantage of the fears, I think, that they've been able to help stoke. You know, economic fears, social, cultural, political fears that a lot of voters have in these places. And they'll win. And what happens after that, if there's widespread illiberal victory, is, you know, pretty discouraging. But the optimist in me would say that, you know, next year maybe there's a chance for a democratic renaissance and a resurgence, and that's what I hope certainly to happen. I mean, I think that public opinion polling data around the world substantiates the notion that most people want to live in societies that are consistent with democratic norms and rules and the rule of law, as well as you can see in places that I mentioned. You know, voters, you know, voting data and other data that's suggestive that voters are aware that there are challenges to democratic governance, and they're mobilizing. So that's my hope.
Okay. Well, we can end on a hopeful note. Peter, thank you so much for joining us and giving us this tour of the world and the year ahead and beyond, and also how to think about the world through a Foresight lens. We really appreciate you taking the time. We're going to take a 15-minute break right now before our next session at 11 o'clock. It's on the future of food security in Africa, so please stick around. It'll be a really compelling session, and we're looking forward to that. So thank you all. Take a break now and be back with you soon. Thank you, Peter.